This presentation will discuss the comparisons and contrasts of early Mesopotamian and biblical myths for History 101 with Professor Donna Sinclair. The learning objective that this presentation deals with is comparing and contrasting the traditions and development of multiple societies of the past. Specifically, I'll be looking at the Mesopotamian culture, three specific myths within that culture, and their comparisons to the Hebrew biblical myths. The focus of this presentation, ancient religious myths of various cultures show similarities in their events and themes, while looking at the small differences can illuminate unique characteristics of each culture. So I'll be going through several of the myths and looking at the similarities between these myths, different events that happened within each myth, and how each culture interpreted them or emphasized different aspects of them to identify more specifically with their cultural traits and purposes. The argument of this presentation, myths help individuals more fully understand their life situation. So many of the myths that I'll be talking about have to do with major life questions, such as the meaning of life and death, how man was created, and some of the tendencies of man to try to understand more fully what is going on in their world and their situations. Also important in this presentation is that Mesopotamian culture has created some of the earliest myths, and these myths have to do with man's attempt to make sense of the world. So definitely this culture studied in our early Western civilization history class had great impacts on other cultures coming later on. The specific myths I'll be looking at have to do with the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enuba Elish, and Atrahasis. Frequently in multiple articles and books that I've read, they had to do with similar events that occurred and were written about in the Hebrew Bible, so I'll be looking at their comparisons as well. One of the themes that showed through in comparisons of these myths was the creation of man. For example, in the Enuma Elish, that myth described that man was created to serve the gods and do their work for them. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, man was created as a character support for the hero. Specifically in that myth, man was created just sort of as a friend to the hero, as a counterpart, sort of a foil to the main hero. That was it. In the Hebrew Bible, in contrast, man was created to look over the earth and had more of an important element in their creation story. A second theme was man's search for knowledge. Many of these myths also told of this sort of emphasis or basic question of man. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh searches for a plant to give immortality. That was after the loss of his friend. He was grieving and went to the gods to try to find a way to still be with him and try to sort of fight against immortality and death. In the Hebrew Bible, also the search for knowledge is shown in the story of Adam and Eve, where they take of the forbidden fruit and become aware of their nakedness. A third theme that was present in each was the Great Flood. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods sent the flood as a punishment for the acts of man, whereas in the Hebrew Bible, God sends the flood because he was disappointed and wanted to restart or start again. Studying these myths between the Mesopotamian and Hebrew culture showed some important themes to consider. For example, the culture, these cultures could have connected with each other while the Hebrews were in exile. For example, the Hebrews could have learned of the Mesopotamian myths when they were held captive in Babylon during the late 6th century. And then when they were able to return after exile, they could have incorporated some of the Mesopotamian myths into the writing of the Hebrew Bible. Or another reason why these themes could be co-shared between the myths and the cultures is that possibly there was an older myth of which both the Mesopotamians and the Hebrews came into contact with, and as times went on and as retellings developed, each culture put a slightly different spin on this origination myth, and that's why we see the unique characteristics. So in conclusion, why does this matter? For me, it showed through that mankind has always searched for reasons for its existence, as well as a search for the power to understand their existence. And also, it shows through that different forms in each culture, the different forms of these myths demonstrate the uniquenesses between each culture that are perfectly valid and important for each culture for their own emphases and cultural traditions to be explained and honored. The personal takeaways. This project was inspired by a book that my dad gave to me that he found of my grandfather's. This was really interesting to me to look through research and stories and areas of life that he was interested in. Even though I didn't know about this or wasn't interested in when he was living, it was really meaningful for me to delve into these aspects that was sort of a family tradition. And in summary, I hope to continue learning more about these projects. I found more books of my grandfather's or more books by authors that he enjoyed, and possibly in the future, maybe I would travel to parts of these areas in the country. So, and finally, my references. Thank you very much for listening.